Welcome to this journey into the shadows of American history, where the line between documented fact and unexplainable phenomenon blurs into something far more disturbing than either could be alone. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Are you alone? Are the lights on? Because what we're about to explore together isn't just a story. It's a testimony that waited 126 years to be heard. This is the account of Elijah Whitmore, a man born into chains in 1808, who survived horrors most cannot imagine, and who somehow continued breathing long after nature should have claimed him. This is the story of a curse that began in blood and bondage, of secrets buried in Missouri soil, and of a silence so profound that when it finally broke, it shattered everything around it. Independence, Missouri. 1887. The Civil War had ended 22 years prior. Reconstruction had come and gone, leaving behind fractured communities, bitter memories, and thousands of formerly enslaved people trying to build lives from ruins. Among them was Elijah Whitmore, living in a weathered cabin 3 miles outside of town, at the edge of a forest locals called the Whispering Woods. At 79 years old, Elijah should have been frail, diminished by age and the brutal decades of bondage he'd endured. But those who encountered him described something else entirely. The town doctor, Samuel Hendricks, wrote in his personal journal, "Saw the Whitmore man today. His eyes are wrong, too clear, too present, like he's seeing through time itself." The townspeople had a name for him, the man who refused to die. Children were warned to stay away from his property. Women crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. Men spoke of him only in whispers, usually after several drinks, and even then they looked over their shoulders as they talked. But in the summer of 1887, a young journalist named Thomas Becket arrived in Independence from St. Louis, carrying letters of introduction and an ambitious plan to document the stories of formerly enslaved people before their testimonies were lost to time. He had no idea what he was about to uncover. Thomas first heard about Elijah at the Independence Gazette office, where the editor, Marcus Webb, laughed bitterly at the mention of the name. "You want to interview Elijah Whitmore?" Webb had said, pouring himself whiskey though it was barely noon. "Good luck getting him to talk. He's been silent for 40 years, won't speak about the old days, won't speak about Ashford, won't speak about anything that matters." "Ashford?" Thomas had asked. The room went quiet. Webb's hand froze halfway to his mouth. "Forget I said that name," the editor finally muttered. "Some things are better left buried." But Thomas Becket was young, ambitious, and convinced that history belonged to everyone. 3 days later, he walked the dusty road to Elijah Whitmore's cabin, carrying his notebook, his pencils, and his certainty that the truth always deserved to be told. He had no way of knowing that some truths carry a price. The cabin sat in a clearing that seemed darker than it should be, even in full daylight. The trees surrounding it were old growth, massive oaks and hickories that had stood for centuries, but something was wrong with them. Their bark was scarred with strange symbols carved deep into the wood. Circular patterns, crossed lines, shapes that hurt. To look at too long. Thomas knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate. The door opened. Elijah Whitmore stood before him, and Thomas Becket understood immediately why people were afraid. The man's eyes were indeed too clear, too sharp for someone who should have been worn down by 8 decades of life and unspeakable suffering. His face was deeply lined, his hair white as bone, but his posture was straight, his hands steady. "I know why you're here," Elijah said, his voice like gravel shifting in a riverbed. "You want the stories. You want to write down what happened before we're all gone." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, "if you're willing to share." Elijah stared at him for a long time. Then he stepped aside. "Come in then, but understand something, boy. Once you hear what I have to say, you can't unhear it, and once it's written down, it's loose in the world. Some things have been kept quiet for good reason." Thomas Becket stepped across the threshold. Behind him in the forest, something that sounded like wind began to whisper through the trees. But there was no wind that day. The air was perfectly still. To understand what happened to Elijah Whitmore, you must first understand Ashford Plantation. And to understand Ashford, you must understand the particular darkness of Missouri in the decades before the Civil War. Missouri entered the Union in 1821 as a slave state through the Missouri Compromise, a political bargain that would echo through American history with devastating consequences. By the 1830s, the state had become a battleground of ideologies, a place where North and South collided in brutal, often violent confrontation. Ashford Plantation was established in 1825 by Colonel Nathaniel Ashford, a veteran of the War of 1812 who claimed 2,400 acres of land along the Missouri River, 20 miles south of Independence. Historical records show he purchased 40 enslaved people between 1825 and 1830, building a hemp and tobacco operation that quickly became one of the most profitable in the region. But profitability alone doesn't explain what Ashford became. The 1840 census lists 87 enslaved people at Ashford. The 1850 census lists 41. Where did the other 46 go? No bills of sale, no death records, no documentation of any kind. Local newspapers from the era contain strange, brief mentions of Ashford. An 1844 article in the Independence Expositor notes, "Residents near the Ashfords. Property report unusual sounds emanating from the grounds after nightfall. Colonel Ashford declined to comment." An 1847 letter from a traveling Methodist preacher to his congregation in Kentucky describes attempting to hold services at Ashford and being forcibly removed. There is something unholy about that place. The people there are afraid, not just of their bondage, but of something else, something they cannot name. Elijah Whitmore arrived at Ashford in 1831, at 23 years old. Sold from a Virginia plantation after his previous owner died. He would remain there for 34 years until Union troops occupied Independence in 1865 and declared all enslaved people in Missouri free. In those 34 years, Elijah witnessed things that would not fit into any historical record, things that existed in the spaces between documented fact and suppressed memory. Thomas Becket's first interview with Elijah took place on June 14, 1887. His notes from that session, now preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, begin with a simple question. "What was your first day at Ashford like?" Elijah's answer was not simple. "You have to understand," Elijah told him, "Ashford wasn't just a plantation. It was a place where Colonel Nathaniel Ashford practiced things he'd learned during his time in the war. Things he'd learned from people who knew the old ways, ways older than this country, older than Christianity." Thomas wrote down every word, his hand beginning to shake without him realizing it. "The colonel believed in power," Elijah continued. "He believed that the land could be forced to give more than it naturally would, that people could be forced to work beyond their natural limits, and he believed that there were ways to make both things happen if you were willing to pay the price." "What kind of ways?" Thomas asked. "Blood ways," Elijah said simply. "The colonel had a place in the woods beyond the hemp fields, a clearing with a stone at its center, older than any building on the property. He went there on certain nights, and he took people with him." The interview continued for 4 hours that first day. When Thomas finally left Elijah's cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky deep red. The symbols on the trees seemed darker, more pronounced in the fading light. Thomas made it halfway back to town before he realized he'd been hearing whispers the entire walk. Voices that seemed to come from the forest itself, speaking, in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They were saying, "Turn back, leave it buried, let us rest." But Thomas Becket did not turn back. Over the next 6 weeks he returned to Elijah's cabin 17 times. Each visit brought new revelations, new pieces of a puzzle that grew more horrifying as it took shape. Elijah spoke of rituals performed at midnight under moonless skies, of symbols drawn in blood on the stone in the clearing, of chants in languages that predated. English predated even the indigenous peoples of the region, languages that seemed to pull at reality itself. He spoke of the disappearances, how people would be taken to the clearing and never return, their absence never explained, their names never mentioned again. How the remaining enslaved people understood that to ask about them was to risk joining them. He spoke of the Colonel's journals, kept locked in his study, filled with diagrams and formulas and carefully documented observations, about what he called the exchange. "What was the exchange?" Thomas asked during their 8th meeting. Elijah's face went distant, his eyes focusing on something beyond the cabin walls. Life for power, pain for prosperity, suffering for success. The Colonel believed that for every measure of agony inflicted and offered correctly, the land would give back tenfold. And he wasn't wrong. Ashford thrived when other plantations failed. The crops grew when others withered. The livestock stayed, healthy when disease ravaged neighboring farms. "At what cost?" Thomas whispered. "At the cost of 46 souls," Elijah replied. 46 people who went into that clearing and never came out. 46 people whose blood soaked into that stone, whose screams were offered to whatever the Colonel was calling to in those rituals. Thomas stopped writing. His hand had gone numb. "How do you know it was exactly 46? He asked. Elijah looked at him with those 2 clear eyes. "Because I kept count," he said. "Because someone had to remember them. Someone had to bear witness." Tell us in the comments what you think happened in that clearing. What do you believe Colonel Ashford was trying to achieve? And more importantly, do you think he succeeded? The first disappearance, connected to Thomas Becket's investigation, occurred on July 19, 1887. Exactly 5 weeks after his first interview with Elijah Whitmore. Samuel Hendricks, the town doctor who had written about Elijah's wrong eyes, failed to return home after making his rounds. His horse was found 3 days later, wandering near the edge of the Whispering Woods, still saddled, its reins torn. The animal was terrified, covered in sweat, its eyes rolling white with panic. Dr. Hendrick's medical bag was found 20 feet into the tree line, its contents scattered across the forest floor. Among the spilled instruments and bottles was a notebook, water-damaged but partially readable. The final entry, dated July 19th, read, "Cannot explain what I'm seeing. The trees, the marks, they're spreading. Started near Whitmore's cabin, now extending half a mile into the woods. Same symbols I saw on the stone when I was a boy, when Father took me to the old Ashford property before they burned it down. They said the fire destroyed everything. They lied. Something is waking up." The notebook ended there, mid-sentence. Dr. Hendricks was never found. The town marshal, James Crawford, organized a search party of 12 men. They combed the Whispering Woods for 3 days, finding nothing but more symbols carved into trees, growing progressively more complex and disturbing the deeper they went. On the 3rd day, the search party emerged from the woods 4 men short. Marshal Crawford's official report, preserved in Jackson County records, states simply, Search discontinued due to dangerous conditions and inexplicable circumstances. Case remains open. His unofficial statement, given years later to his son and recorded in a family diary, was more revealing. We heard them. All 3 days, we heard them. Voices that shouldn't exist coming from everywhere and nowhere, whispering names, calling out. And on that 3rd day when we turned around, 4 of our men were just gone. Standing there one moment, gone the next. We ran, God forgive us, we ran and left them. Thomas Becket documented all of this in his journal, now questioning whether his investigation had somehow triggered these events. But Elijah told him something that made everything worse. "It's not your investigation," Elijah said during their 19th meeting. "It's me. I'm dying. After all these years, it's finally happening. And when I die, everything I've been holding back is going to break loose." "What do you mean, holding back?" Thomas asked. Elijah walked to a corner of his cabin and pulled back a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a metal box, rusted but intact. He lifted it carefully, almost reverently, and set it on the table. Between them, "The night the Union troops came in 1865, Elijah began, "the night we were declared free, some of us went back to Ashford. The plantation house was abandoned. The colonel had fled south. We thought we'd burn it all, destroy every trace of that place." He opened the metal box. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed and brittle. "These are the colonel's ritual journals. I took them before the others burned the house. I thought I could use them somehow. I thought I could find a way to undo what he'd done." Thomas reached for the journals, but Elijah grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," Elijah warned. "Don't touch them unless you're ready to see. These aren't just records. They're active. The symbols in them, the words, they do things." Thomas pulled his hand back slowly. "What kind of things?" "They call back what was sent away," Elijah said quietly. "They open doors that should stay closed. And for 42 years, I've been keeping those doors shut." "How?" Elijah lifted his shirt. His torso was covered in scars, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that matched the symbols on the trees outside. But these scars moved. Thomas could see it clearly in the lamplight. They writhed beneath Elijah's skin like living things, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. "I made my own exchange," Elijah said. "When I realized what the colonel had done, what he'd left behind, I used his own methods against him. I offered myself as a vessel, a container. Everything trying to break through from that clearing, all the pain and rage and hunger that the rituals created, I took it into myself. I've been carrying it for 42 years. "Why?" Thomas whispered, unable to look away from those moving scars. "Because someone had to," Elijah replied. "Because those 46 people deserved better than to be fuel for someone's dark ambition. Because I survived when they didn't, and that meant I had a responsibility." A sound outside the cabin made them both freeze, scratching, long, deliberate scratches against the wooden walls, moving slowly around the perimeter of the building. "It's starting," Elijah said. "My body is failing. The containment is weakening. They know." "Who knows?" Thomas demanded. "The 46, Elijah said, "and what they became after the colonel used them. They're not ghosts, boy. They're not spirits. They're something else, something made from human suffering and occult practice, something that shouldn't exist but does. And they're hungry." The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Thomas could hear breathing now, ragged and wet, coming from just outside the walls. "What do they want?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "To finish what was started," Elijah replied. "The colonel's rituals weren't complete. He died before he could enact the final phase. Whatever power he was trying to summon, whatever he was trying to become, it's still waiting, still trying to manifest. And it needs," Elijah stopped, his face suddenly going pale. "It needs a witness," he finished. "Someone to document it. Someone to spread the word. That's why the doctor was taken. That's why those men disappeared. They were getting too close to the truth, but they weren't the right kind of witness." Thomas felt ice in his veins. "What's the right kind?" Elijah looked at him with something like pity. "Someone who writes things down," he said. "Someone who tells stories, someone who can carry the testimony to a wider audience." The scratching stopped, the breathing stopped, the cabin fell into absolute silence. "It chose you," Elijah whispered. "The moment you knocked on my door, it chose you. And I let you in because I was tired, because I thought maybe after all these years someone should know the truth. But I've made a terrible mistake." Thomas stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm leaving," he said. "I'm going back to St. Louis, and I'm forgetting everything you've told me." "You can't," Elijah said sadly. "It's too late. You've heard too much. You've written too much. You're part of it now." As if to confirm his words, Thomas heard his own name whispered from outside the cabin. His name, spoken in 46 different voices, layered over each other in horrible harmony. Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket. He looked down at his hands and saw, with dawning horror, that the same symbols from Elijah's scars were beginning to appear on his own skin, faint but visible, forming like bruises beneath the surface. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening to Thomas. Is he becoming like Elijah, another vessel, or is something else taking hold? Thomas Becket did not leave Elijah's cabin that night. He couldn't. When he tried to open the door, his hand passed through the handle as if it weren't there. The windows showed only darkness, regardless of which direction he looked. The cabin had become something else, some kind of space outside normal reality. "It won't let you go until you understand," Elijah said, "until you've heard everything." So Thomas sat back down, and Elijah opened the first journal. The handwriting inside was meticulous, each letter formed with careful precision. Colonel Nathaniel Ashford had documented everything with the thoroughness of a scientist conducting experiments, which, Thomas realized with revulsion, was exactly what he'd been doing. Journal entry, March 15th, 1832. Elijah read aloud. "The first offering was completed tonight. Subject, female, approximately 30 years. Name Margaret. The stone accepted her blood readily. The symbols glowed as described in the texts I acquired in New Orleans. She lasted 7 minutes before expiring. 7 minutes of focused suffering, correctly channeled. The next morning, the entire hemp field showed new growth, weeks ahead of schedule. The exchange is real." Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. "He experimented with different methods," Elijah continued, turning pages. "Different ways of inflicting pain, different lengths of suffering. He measured everything, heart rates, vocal patterns during screaming, the precise moment when someone's will broke. He treated human agony like a resource to be mined." The journal entries continued, dated across years: July 1833, November 1835, April 1838, each one detailing another offering, another person reduced to variables in the colonel's occult equations. But the entries changed around 1845. The tone shifted from clinical documentation to something else: excitement, anticipation. Journal entry, August 3rd, 1845, Elijah read, his voice hollow. "Tonight I performed the 17th offering. Something unprecedented occurred. The subject, after expiring, did not remain expired. The body convulsed, rose, and spoke in a voice not its own. It said, 'The threshold weakens. Continue. We are coming through.' I have made contact with the entities beyond the veil. They are aware of my work. They are pleased." Thomas stared at the journal. "The dead spoke to him?" "Not the dead," Elijah corrected. "Something else, something using the dead as a doorway. The colonel believed he was performing traditional rituals, old practices brought from Africa and Haiti and other places. But he got the formulas wrong. Or maybe he got them right in a way he didn't understand. Either way, he didn't just kill those 46 people, he opened them, made them into passages. The second journal was worse. It contained detailed anatomical drawings showing the human body as a map, with specific points marked as nodes of resonance and channels for the outer void. The colonel had been trying to transform the enslaved people at Ashford into something between living and dead, creating what he called perpetual engines of suffering. He believed that if he could keep someone in a state of endless agony, suspended between life and death, they would generate an infinite amount of power that he could harvest, Elijah explained. The rituals weren't about killing, they were about trapping souls in their bodies while inflicting continuous torment. "Did he succeed?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "With 6 of them, yes," Elijah said quietly. 6 people who died but didn't die, whose bodies were placed in chambers beneath the clearing. The colonel fed them his own blood to keep them half alive, visited them daily to renew the symbols binding them. 6 people screaming in the dark for 13 years. Thomas couldn't speak. The horror was too vast. When Union troops approached in 1865, the colonel fled, Elijah continued. He abandoned everything, including those 6. When we found them, they were still alive, still conscious, still suffering after 13 years in absolute darkness and pain. What happened to them? Elijah's face crumpled, the first real emotion Thomas had seen him display. We couldn't save them. Their bodies, it were wrong, changed. We tried to give them water, food, comfort, but they begged us for death. They screamed for it, so we gave them mercy. We ended their suffering the only way we could. He closed the second journal and opened the third. This one was different. The handwriting was erratic, desperate. The entries were dated 1864, the final year of the colonel's tenure at Ashford. He knew he was losing, Elijah said. The war was turning against the South. His power was failing, but he was close to completing something, and he didn't want to leave it unfinished. Journal entry, October 31st, 1864, Elijah read. The final phase requires a specific sacrifice, not just any person, but someone who carries witness, someone who knows the full story, someone who can serve as a bridge between worlds, carrying the testimony to the living while feeding power to the dead. I have selected the subject, a young man who has served at Ashford for 33 years, who has seen everything, who possesses an unusual resilience. His name is Elijah. Tomorrow night he becomes the completion of my work. Thomas looked up sharply. He tried to make you the final sacrifice, he said. Yes, Elijah confirmed. November 1st, 1864. He took me to the clearing. He had everything prepared. The stone was covered in blood from the 6 who remained alive below it. He had symbols painted on my body. He began the chant. What stopped him? Nothing stopped him, Elijah said. He completed the ritual. The cabin's walls seemed to fade as Elijah spoke, revealing glimpses of something else. Thomas saw flashes of images, a clearing bathed in moonlight, a massive stone altar stained black with old blood, a circle of torches casting dancing shadows. The colonel chained me to the stone, Elijah said, his voice distant, remembering. He cut symbols into my flesh with a knife made from human bone. He spoke words in languages dead before Rome fell, and he called out to whatever he'd been communicating with for 20 years, offering me as the completion of his grand work. What did he want to happen? Thomas asked. Apotheosis, Elijah replied. He believed that if he successfully created 47 vessels of suffering, 7 for each of the 7 planetary spheres recognized by medieval occultism, he could ascend to something beyond human. He would become a living conduit for the entities he'd been contacting, gaining their power while maintaining his physical form and consciousness. But he needed you to be the 47th, the final and most important, Elijah confirmed, the one who would anchor all the others, creating a complete circuit of power. He needed someone who had witnessed everything, who carried the weight of all those deaths, all that suffering, someone whose testimony would literally contain the entire truth of Ashford. Thomas felt the marks on his own skin burning. What went wrong? I don't know if anything went wrong, Elijah said. Maybe it went exactly right, just not the way the colonel expected. When he completed the ritual, when he spoke the final words and drove the blade into my chest, I felt something enter me. Not one thing, many things. All 46 people he'd killed, all their rage, all their pain, all their desire for justice and vengeance. They possessed you. They merged with me, Elijah corrected. We became something together, neither living nor dead, neither one consciousness nor many. I was still Elijah, but I was also Margaret and Samuel and Rebecca and all the others. We were a collective, bound together by trauma and blood magic. And the colonel? He tried to claim the power he thought he'd generated, but instead of ascending, he was pulled apart. The 46 took him, used my body as their instrument. We showed him everything he'd done, made him feel every moment of suffering he'd inflicted, compressed 13 years of agony into 13 seconds. He died screaming, and whatever was left of him went into the stone. Elijah touched the scars on his torso. This is what's kept them contained, the symbols the colonel carved into me. They were meant to make me a vessel for his power, but instead they became a prison for the 46. I've been their keeper, their tomb, their voice. Why didn't you die? Thomas asked. The colonel stabbed you in the heart. Because the ritual made me immortal, Elijah said simply, or at least unable to die through normal means. The colonel had designed the 47th vessel to last forever, continuously generating power for his use. That part worked. I've been alive for 42 years past that night, never aging beyond what I was, never sickening, never wearing down. Until now. Until now, Elijah agreed, because immortality granted by dark rituals isn't the same as true immortality. It's a sustained working, requiring constant energy. And after 42 years, I'm tired. The 46 are tired. We're all tired of holding back what wants to come through. What wants to come through? Thomas demanded. Elijah gestured at the journal. The entities the colonel was communicating with. They're real. They exist in some place adjacent to ours. Some reality that touches ours at certain points. The rituals didn't just kill people. They punched holes in the barrier between worlds. 46 holes, and the only thing stopping whatever is on the other side from pouring through is me. Us. The collective consciousness trapped in this body. When we die, Elijah interrupted, those holes will open fully. Everything the colonel invited in will arrive, and it will be hungry. Thomas stood up, pacing the small cabin. Why are you telling me this? What am I supposed to do? I don't know, Elijah admitted. The ritual chose you as a witness, but I don't know what that means. Maybe you're supposed to warn people. Maybe you're supposed to find a way to seal the holes permanently. Or maybe... He trailed off, looking at Thomas with those two clear eyes. Maybe you're supposed to replace me. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. No, Thomas said immediately. Absolutely not. You're already marked, Elijah pointed out, nodding at Thomas's hands. The symbols had grown darker, more defined. The ritual has begun its work on you. When I die, everything I'm carrying will need somewhere to go. It might go into the world, causing catastrophe, or it might go into you, making you the next vessel. There has to be another way. If there is, Elijah said sadly, I haven't found it in 42 years. Outside the cabin, the whispering began again. 46 voices speaking in unison. The witness will carry us. The witness will speak our names. The witness will open the doors. Over the next 3 days, Independence, Missouri changed. Thomas stayed at the boarding house on Main Street, trying to process everything Elijah had told him while researching local records for any information that might help. But each morning brought new horror. Day 1. The postmaster, Gerald Hutchins, vanished from his office during working hours. His assistant found the room empty, the door locked from the inside, and a wet footprint on the floor shaped like a human foot, but with too many toes. Day 2. The entire family living at 47 Elm Street disappeared overnight. Neighbors reported hearing singing from the house around midnight, dozens of voices in harmony, none of them matching any family member. When Marshal Crawford broke down the door the next morning, the house was empty, but the walls were covered in symbols, painted in something that looked like blood, but smelled like rot. Day 3. The church bell rang at 3 a.m., waking the entire town. When people went to investigate, they found the church empty except for a single word carved into the altar. Testimony. Thomas documented everything in his journal, his handwriting becoming increasingly frantic. The marks on his skin had spread to his arms, his chest beginning to form the same pattern he'd seen on Elijah. He could feel something inside him, something foreign yet familiar, like a presence in a room he couldn't see. On the 4th day, he returned to Elijah's cabin and found the old man collapsed on the floor, breathing shallowly. "It's time," Elijah whispered. "I can't hold on much longer." Thomas helped him to his bed, noting how light Elijah had become, as if his body were hollowing out from within. "There's something I didn't tell you," Elijah said, gripping Thomas's wrist with surprising strength, "about the testimony, about what it really means." "What?" "The Colonel's ritual requires a witness not just to observe, but to spread the story, to tell it to others. Each person who hears the full testimony becomes connected, not possessed, but linked. They become part of the chain, part of the circuit." Thomas felt ice in his stomach. "How many people have I told?" "Everyone at the newspaper," Elijah said. "Everyone you interviewed in town. Everyone who's read your notes. You've been spreading it without realizing, creating a network of consciousness that the entities can use as a gateway." "Oh, God," Thomas breathed. "The disappearances aren't random," Elijah continued. "They're the people most deeply connected, the ones who've heard the most of the story. The entities are pulling them through, using them as building blocks for a bridge between worlds." "How do I stop it?" "You can't stop it," Elijah said, "but you might be able to redirect it. If you take my place, if you become the vessel voluntarily, you can hold them back like I have. Or—" He paused, coughing blood. "Or you can complete the testimony. Tell the entire story, every detail, to everyone you can reach. Make it so widely known that it becomes diffuse, spread so thin across so many people that no single point can serve as a gateway. The entities need concentration. Give them dilution instead." Thomas stared at him. "You're saying I should tell everyone? Write it all down, publish it?" "It's a gamble," Elijah admitted. "The Colonel wanted a single witness to carry concentrated power, but if the testimony is scattered across thousands of people, each carrying a tiny fragment, it might prevent the entities from manifesting fully, or it might give them exactly what they need. Which do you think will happen?" Elijah smiled weakly. "I've been holding them back for 42 years. And look what's happening anyway. Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe the testimony was never meant to be hidden. Maybe it was meant to be heard." He reached under his pillow and pulled out a small wooden box. "This contains soil from the clearing. from the exact spot where the stone stands. If you're going to become the next vessel, you'll need to go there. You'll need to stand where I stood. But if you're going to spread the testimony instead, burn this, scatter the ashes, break the connection between the physical location and the ritual. Thomas took the box with shaking hands. How much time do I have? Hours, Elijah said. Maybe less. When I die, everything happens fast. You'll need to choose. What would you do? Elijah closed his eyes. I'd tell the story, he said quietly. I'd make sure every person who died at Ashford was remembered. Every name, every face, every moment of suffering. Not because it would save the world, but because they deserve to be known. Testimony isn't about prevention. It's about witness. It's about saying, this happened, these people existed. Their pain was real. He opened his eyes one last time. But I'm tired, Thomas. I'm so tired. I've carried them for so long. Maybe I'm not thinking clearly anymore. Maybe I just want it to be over. Thomas sat with him through the afternoon, watching the light fade through the cabin windows. The symbols on the trees outside grew darker, more pronounced. The whispering never stopped. At sheer sunset, Elijah Whitmore took his last breath, and everything changed. The official records state that Thomas Becket returned to St. Louis on August 3rd, 1887, and never spoke publicly about his time in independence. He abandoned journalism, took a position as a clerk in a law office, and lived quietly until his death in 1923, at the age of 64. But that's not the whole story. In 1952, a researcher named Margaret Holloway was cataloguing donations to the Missouri Historical Society when she discovered a trunk marked T. Becket Estate. Inside were 17 journals, hundreds of pages of handwritten testimony, and a wooden box containing ashes. Margaret read the journals over the course of 3 days. On the 4th day, she drove to Independence to investigate the claims they contained. Her research notes, preserved in the Historical Society archives, document what she found. August 14, 1952, visited the site of former Ashford Plantation. The land has been abandoned since a fire in 1891. Local residents claim the area is unlucky. Multiple businesses have failed when attempting to develop the property. Surveyed the forest region matching Becket's description. Found extensive tree carvings, symbols matching those detailed in the journals. Most disturbing, the carvings appear to be growing. New wood growth has formed around them, but the symbols remain visible, as if the trees are incorporating them into their structure. Margaret spent 3 months researching Ashford's history, cross-referencing Becket's testimony with census records, property deeds, and newspaper archives. Everything Becket had written was verifiable, the dates, the names, the disappearances. But Margaret also found something Becket hadn't known about. In 1891, 6 years after Elijah Whitmore's death, a group of men from Independence attempted to excavate the clearing Becket had described. They were searching for rumored gold the colonel had supposedly buried there. The Independence Ledger, September 22, 1891. Tragedy struck at the old Ashford property yesterday when excavation work uncovered what workers described as an underground chamber of horrors. 5 men entered the chamber. 3 emerged hours later, incoherent and traumatized. They were taken to the county hospital, where they remain under observation. The 2 men who did not emerge have not been found. Marshal Crawford has sealed the site and warns citizens to stay away from the property. A follow-up article, September 29, 1891. The 3 survivors of last week's incident at Ashford have provided disturbing testimony to authorities. They claim to have discovered 6 stone chambers beneath the clearing, arranged in a circle around a central pit. Inside each chamber were human remains in various states of preservation. But according to the men, the remains were not entirely dead. They moved, stated witness Henry Thompson. They had been down there for decades, but they moved, and they spoke. The survivors also reported seeing extensive writings carved into the chamber walls, describing rituals and invocations in multiple languages. Authorities have declined to excavate further. The site was filled with concrete on September 28th. Margaret drove out to the Ashford site. The concrete seal was still there, broken and weathered but intact. But she noticed something. The trees surrounding the sealed area had all died. Not recently, but decades ago, their bare trunks still, standing like skeletal guardians, and in the dead wood, the symbols continued to grow. Margaret's final research note, dated November 3rd, 1952. I believe Beckett made his choice that night. He chose to spread the testimony. His journals were meant to be found, meant to be read, but I don't think he understood the full implications. The testimony is alive. It propagates itself. Everyone who reads it becomes connected to Ashford, to the Colonel's rituals, to Elijah and the 46. I can feel it. Now, the symbols are appearing on my hands. I hear whispers when I'm alone. I've become part of the story I was trying to document. Margaret Holloway died in 1953 of what her death certificate lists as sudden cardiac failure. She was 34 years old. Her apartment was found covered in symbols, drawn on every surface, matching those found at Ashford and described in Beckett's journals. But her research didn't die with her. In 1978, a paranormal investigator named David Chen read Margaret's notes and decided to visit Independence. He brought recording equipment, cameras, and a team of 5 assistants. His documentary footage, now housed at the University of Missouri, shows the Ashford site in color for the first time. The dead trees, the cracked concrete, the symbols that seem to shift and move when not directly observed. On the 3rd day of filming, Chen's cameras captured something unexplainable. A figure standing at the edge of the dead forest, tall, elderly, with eyes that reflected the camera light like an animal's. The figure spoke, and the audio equipment recorded every word. "The testimony continues," the voice said, and it sounded like one person and many people speaking simultaneously. Every witness becomes part of the testimony. Every person who hears the story carries it forward. You think you're investigating, you think you're documenting, but you're spreading. You're fulfilling the ritual's purpose. The figure stepped forward into clearer view, and Chen could see the symbols moving beneath its skin. Elijah made his choice, the figure continued. Thomas made his choice. Margaret made her choice. Now you make yours. Carry the testimony forward or join us in holding it back. Either way, you're part of it now. The footage ends there. The camera was found 3 days later, sitting in the exact center of the concrete seal, which had somehow cracked open. David Chen and his 5 assistants were never found, but Chen's documentary footage was broadcast on a local television station in 1979, seen by approximately 40,000 viewers, and those 40,000 people became witnesses. Reports began filtering in over the following months, people seeing symbols in their peripheral vision, hearing whispers in empty rooms, waking up with strange marks on their skin that faded by morning. A pattern emerged. The more someone thought about the Ashford story, the more they researched it, the stronger the connection became. In 1985, a psychology professor named Dr. Sarah Martinez wrote a paper titled Mass Hysteria and the Ashford Phenomenon, attempting to explain the reports rationally. She theorized that the documentary had created a shared delusion, a form of psychological contagion spreading through suggestible populations. She died during the writing of that paper, found at her desk with symbols carved into her arms. The paper was never completed. By 1990, Independence had developed a reputation in certain circles. Ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and curiosity seekers regularly visited the Ashford site. most left with nothing more than blurry photos and vague unease, but some never left at all. The local sheriff's department has an unofficial policy. They don't investigate disappearances connected to the Ashford property. They've learned from experience that searching only produces more disappearances. In 2003, the county attempted to develop the land one final time. A corporate developer purchased the property, planning to build a shopping complex. Construction began in April. By July, the entire crew had quit. They reported tools disappearing, equipment malfunctioning, and symbols appearing overnight on freshly poured concrete, as if carved from beneath. The developer abandoned the project. The land remains empty to this day. Tell us in the comments. Do you think the testimony should continue to spread, or should it be buried forever? And if you've read this far, are you now part of it too? So, we return to where we began, to the question of testimony, to the question of witness. Was Thomas Becket right to document what Elijah told him? Was Margaret Holloway right to investigate? Was David Chen right to film? Or should some stories remain untold? The entity that appeared in Chen's footage said something important. Every witness becomes part of the testimony. If that's true, then by listening to this story, by engaging with it, you've become connected to Ashford. To the Colonel's rituals, to Elijah's burden, to the 46 souls who died in that clearing. But perhaps that's not a curse. Perhaps that's exactly what should happen. The Colonel wanted to hide his crimes, to bury them beneath rituals and symbols and dark power. He wanted to transform human suffering into personal gain, to treat people as resources, as fuel for his ambitions. Elijah spent 42 years holding those crimes inside himself, carrying the weight alone, keeping the testimony locked away where it couldn't spread. Thomas Becket chose differently. He chose to document, to write, to preserve the testimony, even knowing the risks. And now the testimony has reached you. There are 3 prevailing theories about what's really happening at Ashford. Theory 1, the supernatural explanation. The Colonel's rituals were real. He successfully contacted entities from another dimension or reality. The 46 people he murdered became conduits for those entities, and their suffering created permanent holes in the barrier between worlds. Elijah, through his own ritual transformation, became a living seal, holding those holes closed. When he died, the seal weakened, and the entities began pulling people through, trying to establish a permanent gateway. The testimony spreads their influence, creating a network of potential gateways across anyone who hears the story in its entirety. Theory 2, the psychological explanation. The Ashford story is a powerful psychological contagion, a form of shared delusion that propagates through susceptible individuals. The Colonel was simply a sadistic killer who dressed his crimes in occult trappings. Elijah, traumatized and disturbed by what he witnessed, developed elaborate delusions about rituals and entities. Thomas Becket, Margaret Holloway, David Chen, and others became caught in a cascade of confirmation bias and suggestion, seeing patterns where none existed. The disappearances are either unrelated coincidences or the result of people deliberately vanishing to perpetuate the legend. Theory 3, the historical conspiracy. Something terrible did happen at Ashford Plantation, but the supernatural elements are a cover story created to distract from real historical crimes. Perhaps the Colonel was part of a larger network of people experimenting with advanced techniques of torture and control. Perhaps the rituals were code for something else entirely: human trafficking, illegal medical experiments, or political murders. The entities might be human organizations that continue to exist, eliminating anyone who gets too close to the truth. The testimony spreads because it's designed to, leading investigators down supernatural rabbit holes while the real conspiracy remains hidden. Which theory do you believe? Or do you have your own explanation? The truth is, we may never know what really happened at Ashford Plantation. The original documents are fragmentary. The witnesses are dead. The site itself remains unexplored, sealed beneath concrete and guarded by local policy and superstition. But the testimony continues. Every year, more people discover Thomas Beckett's journals. More researchers attempt to investigate. More documentary makers, podcasters, and writers tell versions of the story. And every year, some of them disappear. Is that because the testimony is real? Because the ritual continues to claim witnesses? Or is it because people want to believe in something larger than themselves? In mysteries that can't be explained, in darkness that validates their own fears? I don't have the answer. Nobody does. What I do know is this. 46 people died at Ashford Plantation. Their names have been lost to history. Their families were scattered. Their suffering was used as fuel for someone's dark ambitions. Whether the supernatural elements are real or not, that suffering was real. Those deaths were real. And the systematic erasure of their stories, the attempt to bury them beneath silence and fear, was real too. Thomas Becket chose to document their testimony, to give voice to the silenced, to say, this happened, these people existed, their pain matters. Perhaps that's what the testimony has always been about. Not supernatural rituals or psychological contagion, but the simple, powerful act of remembering, of refusing to let atrocities be forgotten. The 46 people who died at Ashford deserve to be remembered. Elijah Whitmore, who carried their memory for 42 years, deserves to be remembered. Thomas Becket, who documented their stories at great personal risk, deserves to be remembered. And now you carry that memory too. What you choose to do with it is up to you. You can dismiss it as fiction, as entertainment, as a scary story for a Friday night. You can investigate further, adding your own research to the testimony. Or you can simply remember, holding space for the truth that beneath every legend there are real people who suffered real harm. The testimony of Ashford Plantation continues. 138 years after Elijah Whitmore died, we're still talking about it, still wondering, still witnessing. Maybe that's exactly what he wanted, or maybe it's exactly what we need. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of America's darkest corners. If you found this story compelling, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to join our haunted community. We explore forgotten testimonies, buried histories, and the thin places where the past refuses to stay dead. Leave a comment telling me, do you believe the testimony should continue spreading, or should some stories stay buried? And if you're feeling brave, tell me what time it is where you are and whether you're watching alone. Until next time, remember, history isn't just what's written in books. Sometimes it's what's carved into trees, whispered in darkness, and carried in the scars of those who survived. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe. This has been another journey into testimony. I'll see you in the shadows.